This morning is an apoplectic Jonathan Liss, political commentator, and Noah Khogali, who is Conservative councillor for Strathern, and looking much better without your plaster cast on.
Yeah, I am fully unslinged now, which is a
young
nice
people
change.
heal so quickly.
Totally just. I'd still be wearing it. That's how old I am. Let's start, actually. You'd be a great person to start with, Noah, here, as a young person. Because, well, we were talking about this earlier with Ed. This big article in the Telegraph this morning. The US is planning to station nuclear weapons in the UK for the first time in 15 years because of the threat from Russia increasing. This is really near me, actually, at RAF Lakenheath in Suffolk. The contracts have been seen by the Telegraph. They confirm the US intends to place nuclear warheads 3 times the strength of the Hiroshima bomb at the airbase. I remember this well. In 2008, they took the nuclear weapons away. They're coming back for the first time. Also, we've had the head of the British Army, Sir General Patrick Sanders, saying that actually we need to equip our forces properly. We've talked this morning about conscription. As a relatively, or as a young person growing up in this country, what does this news do for your sense of well-being?
I mean, this is all fairly unsurprising, I think. I think there has been a growing awareness, I think, of even the most uninterested in international relations young people, that this is the direction we're going. And I think probably the conscription chat this week has made people a little bit more on edge. But this, I think, is a less surprising development. I mean, it wasn't actually that long ago that the US took away the nuclear weapons that they had in the UK. I think it was, 2008. This isn't some massive change from the past 50 years worth of policy.
But Jonathan, the language is now changing, isn't it? The fact is, we've talked about national service, we're talking about conscription. How much of this is actually true intent, and how much of this is actually politicians using this as leverage? There's no doubt the UK is under pressure to increase its spending, GDP spending. It's at 2.3% currently. What your thoughts? I think you're slightly older than Noah. Your thoughts on where we are?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I'm not old enough to remember the Greenham Common protest.
I am.
But it's extraordinary the fact that in the 80s, this was such a hot issue, and people were motivated to mobilise in their thousands, and this extraordinary social movement that seems such a long time ago, in the sense that it would be hard to imagine a similar act now. But nuclear weapons are much more dangerous and powerful than they were 40 years ago, and they're getting more so all the time. And so actually it seems strange that there isn't more of a conversation about this, and that there almost certainly won't be major media pickup on this story. But it is an important story, and I think that we do have to have more of a conversation, a kind of a more philosophical conversation about nuclear weapons and what we're doing with a nuclear arsenal in the first place. Because when you think about it, it's very, very unlikely that we would ever use nuclear weapons ever, because we would never preemptively use a nuclear weapon on anybody. If we hadn't been attacked with a nuclear weapon, we wouldn't use one. But then if we were attacked with a nuclear weapon, it seems impossible to justify. I mean, there might be there might be sort of extraordinary circumstances or exceptional circumstances where a state might have had more nuclear weapons and a nuclear weapon was used to kind of eliminate the rest of that state's arsenal, for example. But basically, if a state used a nuclear weapon against you, and with all the devastation that incurs, if you then use a nuclear weapon against them, you're just going to be committing the same war crime that they've just committed. And that's, it's just the same as kill the other person to eliminate the first one, or to kind of cancel out the first one. That's not how it works. That's not how it works in criminal law either.
Point you made, why is it not everywhere? And I agree with you, because I am old enough to remember this, and this sent a really chilling message to me, because I was saying earlier, I remember adverts running on the television about what you do in the event of a nuclear war. I mean, it was ridiculous. We were told to go under a table and lock yourself in a cupboard.
But they have to tell you something, don't they? They can't say just get ready to die.
And also, if you've got these nuclear weapons which are 50 kilotons, 3 times the size of what we saw at Hiroshima, that unnerves me.
We've been told, haven't we, to support the massive spending that we have on Trident, because it is the thing that will stop there ever being a nuclear war. So I think we have to have faith in that, and that's where I sit on this. I sit that nobody's going to start a nuclear war. I know that that's probably not sensible with Putin and China.
But only if those leaders are of sound mind. That's the other issue here. In fact, Russia has now responded saying that they view this as an escalation.
Which it is.
Yeah, and
is it?
They said that they've always maintained that if this happened, it would for them be an escalation. And realistically, what are they going to do? They're going to put a few more people on their naughty list, but they're not realistically going to do
How much of this is actually Putin judging the West resolve? Because clearly he has seen the diminution of our armed forces, and he has tested that. We saw him appearing this week as well in the border with NATO bordering countries. So Putin is very much saber rattling, I think, or testing our resolve.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something that will be interesting as well for especially the US this year, if Trump surges to victory, as he kind of unfortunately looks, or in my mind at least, looks like he's going to do, then you have a situation where the US could start withdrawing from Europe again, or trying to, and then that makes the whole situation almost entirely different again.
So just in terms of GDP, I will ask this, but I asked it last week. So 2.3% we spend currently. Would you like to see it increased, and if so, what level to?
I don't know. I think that would be up to the people that actually are, the actual military leaders. I could say a random amount of money, but I don't know what that actually means. I think we probably do need a larger army, and I think rhetorically, from what I've read and heard, it seems that we've been preparing for a war that is not a ground war, but that looks like if something does spark with Russia, that is probably what it would be, and it would probably be in Europe.
Do you think much of this is actually just our armed forces at a senior level finally thinking it's the only way they're going to get a bigger budget? If they suddenly start talking about war, conscription, they may be able to make the case for a bigger budget.
Yeah, of course. And you kind of having all these briefings, which are public briefings by leaders about how we might be at war with Russia. But how much 5 years as though Russia can't sort of monitor our media and see that people are talking about this.
But how much of this is, and I think that's where René's going, is actually to coerce the politicians into spending more money. When you look at the GDP spending, so ours is 2.3%. NATO has this 2% enshrined, which many European countries still aren't at. But you've got the US at 3.5%. You've got places so Ukraine is currently 34%. Russia has gone from 4% to 40%.
And that's going to have a huge knock-on for the Russian economy as well. I mean, you can't just go ramp up your defence spending by that and not expect to see shortfalls elsewhere. And obviously, the sanctions are going to feed into that as well. So we kind of don't really have such a conversation about what's happening domestically in Russia, but maybe that's a conversation that, I'd be quite interested to watch in order to participate in. But obviously, for Ukraine, it's an existential matter. So you'd expect Ukraine to be vastly increasing.
I suppose that's the argument, that it will come to a point where it's an existential matter for all of us.
Right. Well, absolutely. And this is why. And just to sort of come back to the idea of conscription, we used to sort of Boris Johnson Telegraph saying that he sort of be fighting.
Jolly
and
then would.
Then you kind of think, maybe you shouldn't be advocating for the man who wants to maybe pull out of NATO and sort of just completely destroy that alliance.
But we were talking,
and sort of end support for Ukraine.
But we were talking about this. Of course, Boris Johnson is too old to.
Of course, I'm just using it as an example of the hypocrisy that any Conservative who has the gall to call themselves a patriotic Conservative and who has a gall to sort of, wave flags and to welcome Zelensky and then goes on the airwaves to back Donald Trump, they should, basically be all but kicked out of that.
But wasn't Donald Trump's point really that NATO is a good thing, but not if he, as a country, has to carry it?
Underpin it.
And was he not just trying to get all of the other members
That's Donald Trump 1.0. I think we're talking about the next
incarnation. But what Trump wanted was NATO to increase its spending.
Which is legitimate. It's a legitimate request that if you're sort of depending on the US, you have to do your bit as well. It's like when you have a pot and you kind of like, okay, we'll fill this up, but you need to do your bit as well. I think that's a reasonable demand, but he wasn't being reasonable. He didn't cripple NATO, thank goodness, but people are talking about what might happen. And this is a Donald Trump who's very angry, very vindictive, and very unpredictable.
But actually, he speaks, I think, for a lot of the American public. Remember, he supplied anti-tank weapons to Ukraine, for example. So actually, what the US
he was impeached for threatening to withhold.
But is this not just the anti-Trump rhetoric, speaking over here, Jonathan, to be fair? So you're not going to say, well, actually, that's a reasonable position, and if he continues along that line. I just feel the left, we hate Trump coming out.
The sounds for me from the Trump campaign have been that Trump's way of dealing with international issues is to try and find a middle ground, whereas the entirety of the Western world on this has, in my view, rightly said there is no middle ground. Ukraine's Ukraine, their borders are their borders, Russia, you leave. But then you've got potentially the quote-unquote leader of the free world saying, or taking a completely different tact, and that would represent a quite a seismic change in position for someone like Boris, who hasn't really taken that position before.
We don't need to talk about Johnson, I guess, anymore, because he's not coming back to the political scene anytime soon.
Well, just on that note, and you've derailed me there slightly, if Boris Johnson isn't coming back, Rishi Sunak, we've been asking this morning, just in terms of that, and trying to resurrect the Conservative Party campaign, they're at 20%. So if you were to choose a leader that you think could turn it around, who would it be?
What a leader from which perspective? For me, myself?
No.
The Tories.
Let's just pretend you're a Conservative strategist.
Well, then I will look. Realistically, there are very few people that are currently in any position of leadership in the Conservative Party who I think could take the reins. It would have to be after the election. I don't think they would stand a chance. Anyone would stand a chance before. But I suppose it would be the Mordaunt or Badenoch.
Which
Mordaunt, bless her, it would be her sort of third attempt, I suppose. And she thinks that she might think that she has a decent shot now. And Badenoch thinks that she'll carry the right. I don't think Braverman would stand a chance, to be honest. She'd maybe have sort of 10 people at most behind her.
And what about you, Noah? What do you think?
Well, I think if it comes down to the stick or twist argument, I think changing at this point would just be absolute lunacy. That would be just the worst idea possible.
But staying, they're going to be obliterated.
So, okay,
there is more of a route.
So let me just throw something else at you. What happens if Nigel Farage actually decides that he is going to re-enter politics, but he joins the Conservative Party?
I don't think the Conservative Party let Nigel Farage in, ever.
I think they would have him like a shot.
They would have
Yes.
him at the drop of a hat.
So do I.
I think you would see too much of a rebellion from historically large names in the Conservative
from the
Party.
One Nation
But you say,
Tories.
you say that, but actually when they look at their majorities and they realise they're about to be unemployed, maybe they will just press that button.
But also what you'd have then is a turbocharging of what we're seeing already, where slightly more liberally minded Conservative voters just leave the party en masse. You can see like another party founded altogether.
Well,
more
everyone's
like
leaving
a
en
centrist.
masse.
Yes, but you would have literally a kind of a complete desertion in the blue wall, and there's no guarantee that there'd be enough people in the so-called red wall to kind of stem that.
But you're assuming that the blue wall want these Liberal Democrats who say they're Tories. Maybe they just want some Tories.
Polling evidence would contradict that. They don't want a hard right Conservative Party. They want more of a Cameroon
We're not
type
talking
Conservative
hard right.
Party. Well, I think Nigel Farage is hard
I don't
right.
think he is hard right, but I would say that, wouldn't I?
Well,
I think actually what it is about small government, lower taxes. That's what people want. They want.
All right.
I don't
people
think
people do. I don't think Nigel Farage is
Just-
not appealing to liberals in Surrey. I'm sorry.
But well, that's interesting. But I think what liberal Conservatives in Surrey want is low tax. They want a Conservative Party that is actually Conservative, not just in name, but actually follows through. Just in terms of that, of course, Nigel Farage, when he went to Conservative Party conference, was welcomed like the Messiah.
I know, and there is an element
Very
of the
naughty
Conservative
boy.
Party. There is an element of the Conservative Party that would probably welcome Nigel Farage with open arms. But this is partially the paradox that the Conservative leadership are going to face at the moment. Is some people think the party are too far left, some people think the party are too far right. Where do they actually fall, and where do they go to win this election? That's the
Or
challenge.
where do they split and make proper parties rather than just this? This we're a ball church doesn't work anymore because it isn't. It's the Lib Dems, the Tories.
All parties are coalitions,
but not as much as this. This
The
now
Tory
doesn't
party has
work.
always been that,
I
though.
think that's a valid point, and that's why we're seeing the Conservative Party sort of
Yes.
self-implode, because
And-
it can't satisfy
Yes.
all its bases.
And currently there are 5, if not 6, factions within the Conservative Party. Maybe that's the point, though, Noah. It is now crunch time, where they've been held together, sort of, but at the moment we're seeing that fragmentation. Is that inevitable?
I don't think it is in the long term. Look, there will be a rough period, but I think in the long term, the Conservative Party have always proved that at the end of the day, it can pull itself together. It might take time, but eventually the Conservative Party will find a leader that pulls together the left and the right and the centre and brings everyone with it.
What's
It will
fascinating about this is if you remember when Boris won these 80 seats in this landslide, the headlines on every newspaper were that the Labour would not be in power for another 10 to 15 years. And yet, look where we are.
And
But
people
also
say that
remember-
Labour's going to be in power for a decade afterwards.
Agreed.
That's, we just don't know
We don't,
anything.
yeah.
That's the basic point. We just don't know anything.
And also you have to factor in the other thing. The Brexit Party stood down in favour of Boris Johnson. So, of course, that sways things. And given that, and I have to be careful what I say, but given the resurgence of reform sitting on 13%, that is a major problem for Rishi Sunak. The Times this morning saying getting rid of Rishi Sunak won't save the Tories. Very quickly before the break, we're seeing this across Europe, actually. So anti-European parties are set for EU victory. Anti-European populist parties are on track to make big gains. So this is from all 27 EU member states. suggesting that right-wing parties are on course to finish first in 9 countries, including France, Poland, Austria, and then second or third in another 9, including Germany, Spain, Sweden and Portugal. What's going on?
I think this is just kind of what you get when you have a world that is struggling at the moment. And we have this rhetoric within the UK, especially from the left, that, you know, everything was Truss's fault, everything's Rishi's fault. But the world is struggling right now. And ultimately, what you get when the world is struggling is populism, because people want voices that they can get emotional about. And, you know, that is reasonable in its most base sense, but that is exactly what's happening. The struggles that we're facing in the UK are not just about the UK. That's a very insular way to look at it. This is something that the whole world is facing. It's something the US is facing. It's something that Europe's facing. And it's something that we are going to have to, you know, work out the long-term future of the Western world together. Because this isn't a problem that is only in the UK.
So it's really fascinating, having worked with the AfD in Germany, who were sort of our bedfellows over in the European Union. They're trying to ban them. Noah's point is valid, which is you are seeing this rise of the right. What's your view on that? Is it people saying, oh, we've had enough?
I think a lot of what Noah says is really valid, and I think it is a lot of people. The backlash is to all kinds of things, and you have these sort of political moments where there's kind of a violent, kind of almost like a violent jolt, revolt against what is perceived as establishment norms and conventions. It doesn't happen all the time, and it's not universal. We just saw, you know, a reversal of that trend in Poland, for example, where they had an authoritarian right-wing government which was sort of kicked out. And, you know, it's not happening everywhere. You are seeing sort of some social democratic victories in you know, we still have a social democratic party in government in Denmark, for example. Ireland, I think you're seeing it not from the right but from the left. You know, Sinn Féin probably winning the next election there. So it's not, and obviously you have in Spain, you know, you have Pedro Sanchez.
We were talking about that, the
electoral.
electoral. But that's to do with their electoral.
Of course, and
system.
you're always going to have particularities across the board. And I'm not even sure. I mean, I don't know what's happening with the Netherlands. I haven't heard about that for a few weeks. But
with Spain,
everyone has their own particular.
They have their particular things.
And in the Netherlands, again, because of their voting system, they will just make sure those parties, as much as they hate each other, that they stop him taking the premiership, even though he got most of the votes. That happened in Spain, actually, this time round.
Well, you have all. If it's legitimate constitutionally, it's legitimate. I think, you know, after the last few years, we can say that in this country too. But I think one thing I would say is that when you have this sort of European Parliament movement, it's not going to be, I think a lot of people, Brexiters, are sort of, you know, salivating about the end of the European Union. These parties do not want to leave the European Union.
But what's fascinating for me is that many of these parties are saying that EU has gone too far and they want it to be reformed. That was completely the same feeling we had when we went in, saying we will stay if it reforms. But it didn't reform and it didn't listen.
When did you say that?
We said it right at the beginning, before, as the Brexit Party. We thought we could affect change, and then when we were campaigning, we decided that it was not.
So you're saying the Brexit Party thought it could remain in the EU?
No, not by the time we stood, no. The whole point of that was
right.
we were out.
If you're talking about an early 90s position,
I am talking about when
before Brexit was the thing. Then
exactly. But it's fascinating to see what's going on across Europe. Jonathan and Noah, stay where you are. Time for a break. We've got more coming up for you after this break. This is TalkTV. Welcome back to Talk Today. I'm sorry, I'm giggling away at some of the messages. I don't know whether to read them out, Jonathan, because they... Can I read... Are you
they're
okay?
not too personal.
No, they're...
As long as they're like...
Good morning to the smartest and prettiest pair on TV. That's very nice of you.
I think that's about us.
They definitely are. This morning was going so well until I saw Jonathan this, which reminded me to throw out my limp lettuce from the fridge. You see, I said it was a bit...
How lovely.
Yes, they're finding you a little bit. They're finding you a little bit limp this morning. I've got from Robert H. Jonathan, he's too complacent. Never underestimate your enemies. Remember a certain Hitler. That was a funny little man. Putin, KGB thug. Strengthen our defences. Treat our military with respect. Brilliant show, especially the silent running.
So
we had no sound for the first 38 minutes.
No, on television only. On television only. Was it 38 minutes?
38 minutes.
It was a golden 38 minutes. So, yeah.
I'd watch that.
Ben says Europe reminds me of 1930s in Germany. The turmoil that big government has caused is being pushed back. History repeats itself as it always does. A better question, David, for you, and I'm saying if you were to change leader, can the Conservative Party actually bring this back? They've given them 6 weeks to sort themselves out. A better question, David, is if Sunak and friends hadn't backstabbed Boris, would the Conservatives be in the mess they are in now? Carl in York says Starmer has already won and a technocratic totalitarian dystopia awaits. I pity your children. Good morning, Dr. David and Dr. Rennie. Great show as always. Thank you, Paula in Kent, sunny Kent. I think the Tories have no chance of recovery before the next general election. I'm also very sceptical about David Cameron's return. I wouldn't be surprised if the out-of-touch MPs and Tory movers and shakers think he could step in to lead again. Well, I wouldn't be at all surprised by that either. Sadly, says Amanda, there is no one in the Tory party or Labour with a backbone or a sense of purpose and authority to lead this country. Being in the EU for so long and not being 100% in charge has made them lazy and it's made them self-centred. Back to our head-to-head. Jonathan Liss and Noah Khogali join us this morning. Just very quickly, if I can, the consultants, we talked about this earlier, the junior doctor strike continues, 35% they want. The consultants, many of my friends are consultants, yes, I'm that old, and they have turned down this pay offer, 4.95% on the back of a 6% increase. In fact, for some of those consultants, they get a 20% uplift in their pay. I think people around the country will be thinking, I'm struggling to put food on the table. I can't actually heat my house. And here are these well-paid doctors, paid by the taxpayer, demanding more money.
I mean, it's close as well on the vote. It was 51%, I believe.
51% of 64. Only 64% of consultants voted.
So it's 30% of the senior doctors voted.
But it does mean that hopefully we are another step closer, maybe half a step to this being resolved. But I think the concern from the government, obviously, is if they go in with too high of a return offer, I suppose, that other people are going to start striking again, and this just spirals into
What would you offer
chaos.
them?
I don't know.
So 4.95 plus 6. Actually, it's actually a very complicated deal. But let's say, so that's 10.95. Some changes to their contract as well. My understanding is actually there's more in there than just
changes to get up to higher pay.
Exactly. So they're reducing their pay bands,
which alone seems quite valuable. I'm not sure about the number of years that it's reducing the time by, but that does seem like somewhere that you could find some movement without actually having to change the percentages too much, because people aren't going to strike to be able to move up quicker, but they will strike for a higher pay percentage. So that could be somewhere where the government could find some movement.
Are we being disingenuous, Jonathan? I mean, these are highly trained people who dedicated their careers to this. The NHS needs consultants, desperately needs consultants. Should we pay them a lot more?
I think that everyone in the NHS should be paid a lot more. That's you would expect me to say that.
Yeah.
Look, I've always said, whenever we talk about this, it's not my position to comment on how people vote in sort of strike ballots or how unions position themselves or what the
What's
figures.
A fair offer,
what
though?
figures? I don't. I think that it's fair to. I would always err on the side of giving unions most of what they want, and obviously people enter negotiations with more than they think they're going to get. It's more than, look, everyone's going to ask for something that they want to get in an ideal world. No one's going to sort of make their first position a low one, so you expect it to be high. But if you look at also what's happened to salaries over the last few years, they would argue they're simply trying to get back to the figure that it was at, say, 10 years ago, before sort of inflation and all the rest of it.
Jonathan,
so
I am aware of consultants who, with their NHS work and their private work, are earning in excess of £400,000 a year who are on the picket lines. Is that morally bankrupt in a cost of living crisis?
I think that consultants do an extremely important job. We all agree
Answer
on
the
that.
question.
We all agree on that. Look, obviously there are some consultants who do very, very well for themselves. I would love to be earning that kind of money. I'm not saving people's lives day in, day out. Although I'm saving their souls politically, but that's something slightly different.
But if you are advocating for a pay rise, shouldn't you actually have a number in your head?
I'm not the government, David. I kind of, obviously my instinct is to side with the people who are on strike, and I think that if you're a doctor and it goes against every grain in your body to go on strike when you're to put your energy into that instead of your patients. And I sort of think that if you're doing that, there has to be a really good reason for you to do that.
Does it go against the grain, every grain of every doctor? I'm
Not every doctor,
I'm not
but
sure it
No,
does.
it
And
doesn't.
particularly the juniors.
Yeah.
I'm just
You two
saying.
are
I mean,
hardened cynics.
I have lots of friends who are junior doctors who wouldn't strike, can't strike because they just feel too strongly about their patients. So there is a hardcore group of doctors here. We know where they come from and we know what they want to achieve. It's not a 35% pay increase, it's to see the Tories gone.
Well, look, I mean, people, of course, might want that, but I think it's a stretch to say that's what they're trying to achieve, and they're certainly not going to achieve it. The Conservatives are going to achieve that quite easily on their own.
I agree.
And let me just give Noah the final word here. How much of this is political, do you think?
I think it's fairly substantial amount of it is political. Look, you've got a government that is coming into an election period that is under pressure to deal with strikes, that they've made the waiting list a top priority, that a lot of cards now are held by unions, and that's something the government has kind of they've put themselves in that position, I suppose. But it is something that the unions know the government need to sort out ASAP, and they're taking advantage of that.
Thank you very much indeed, both of you. Jonathan Liss, political commentator, Noah Khogali, Conservative councillor for Strathern.